Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have made significant advances within the city of Hulyaipole, where they are storming the fortifications of the Ukrainians in the southern parts of the city. The Russians have managed to gain control over a wide area of the fortifications to the southeast of the city. Following the initial push through from the eastern flank, the Russians consolidated their positions within the northern parts of the city and crossed over the river to consolidate their positions further in the eastern flank, pushing through the residential area and flanking the fortifications from their weak spot, which is from the northern flank, pushing through the fortifications and advancing into the central parts of the city, reaching the flank of the final fortifications along the highway to the south. With this, the Russians will likely push to gain control of the remaining fortifications here along the southern flank, and then connect their forces through the highway from the south up towards the city to consolidate their positions and the supply line from the south, allowing for additional roads leading into the city from the southern flank to continue offensive operations to gain full control of the city and push through the next defensive fortifications in the direction of the town of Selishne, which has a rail connection down south. The Russians at the same time managed to gain control over the remaining parts of the northern bank of the Fier river, gaining full control over the northern section of the city, and pushed through the river here towards the northern outskirts of Hulyaipole as well, where they managed to cut off the connection to Zelene further north. This leaves just the western highway remaining under Ukrainian control. All other roads have been cut off physically by the Russians. The Russians will here aim to either encircle the Ukrainian forces by pushing through the fortifications from the northern and southern flanks, operationally encircling them by cutting off the highway but not physically consolidating their positions on the western outskirts, or leaving the road open to then push through the central parts to gain control over the central apartment complex buildings. The city has this central apartment complex area and school area in the central parts of the city, which the Russians have reached the outskirts of with this recent push, allowing them to reach the main defensive positions of the Ukrainians within the city. If they're able to gain control over the central parts, which is this section here, well then they have gained control over the city, and the Ukrainians are the ones on the outskirts trying to hold on to their positions, as the Russians will be slowly pushing them out towards the highway and the fortifications on the western flank. And as mentioned in the previous update, gaining control over Hulyaipole is extremely significant for this section of the front line because of the highways and railways that connects up towards the city from the southern and eastern flanks. This allows for a significant improvement of the Russian supply line here along the first and second line of defense in the Zaporizhia region, and will completely switch the balance of power in this section completely in favor of the Russians, because the Russians' biggest weak point at this point here along the first and second lines of defense is their lack of supply lines. The current supply lines are extremely spread out and stretched out, with the Russians having to supply either from Mariupol or from the city of Donetsk, push through all the way through Volodar to Velika Novosilka, and from there through the first and second lines of defense towards the frontline positions. That is the only route the Russians can resupply their forces through reliably. With this, the Russians will be able to supply through Berdyansk, Mariupol, or Melitopol through Crimea as well, in addition to the eastern supply line. So this brings a completely new supply line that is extremely well connected through both railways and highways to the frontline positions along Hulyaipole, not to mention the fact that Hulyaipole is the largest city in the near vicinity, within 10 or 20 kilometers in a radius, and it can act as a logistical hub for the Russian forces in the area. This simply means that the Russians will gain a significant advantage if they capture the city, and well, they are getting closer and closer to it, with them now holding control over approximately half of the city. To the north of this, the Russians continue their operations along the second line of defense, gain control over Ostapivske, the fortifications on the eastern flank along the highway, and have gained a foothold within the southern outskirts of Andreevka. The Russians continue offensive operations here near Vedratne to gain control over Andreevka and the eastern bank of the Fier river. The objective is here to secure the northern flank in the direction of Pokrovsk, creating a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, and to outflank the defensive line of the Ukrainians here along the Fier river, where they were looking to consolidate their positions along the eastern flank from the Nelivka and down south towards Hulyaipole, and connect their forces as they continue pushing through the second line of defense from several sectors along the Hulyaipole river, where they're crossing over the river through towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and storming them directly, in addition to the push on the northern and southern flanks. In the northeastern direction near Fier, the Russians have managed to gain control over the fortification here to the south of Markove that overlooks the road towards the fortifications along the road. This will allow the Russians to outflank the fortifications of the Ukrainians in the area and push up towards Markove from Maiske in the south. However, the Ukrainians have managed to consolidate their positions here to the west of Markove along the fortifications, where they've managed to regain control of these fortifications after Russian DRG units pushed through the Ukrainian defensive lines and managed to infiltrate these fortifications on the rear of Markove, but the Russian operations continue here near Fedorivka and the northern flank of Vyrolyovivka, on the northeastern flank of Kostantinivka itself. Further north in the direction of Kubansk, the Russians have managed to advance here to the northeast of Kurilivka, reaching the outskirts of the town. This is from a recent push by the Russian forces, where they're pushing through the fortifications along the highway to reach the rear of Pishane and Kurilivka. I believe at this point, Pishane is likely just a gray zone where Russian and Ukrainian forces continue infiltrating each other. However, they are constantly struck by drones and artillery. That means any forces that enter this area is constantly bombarded, and it is the same to the northwest of Pishane in the outskirts of Kurilivka. At this point, this area is just a massive gray zone where the Russians can push through if they're able to consolidate their positions near Petropavlivka and Kocherivka, and that is why the fighting is mainly centered around the towns here on the eastern flank of Kubansk. As for Kubansk itself, the Russians were pushed back further within the city itself, back towards the apartment complex area, where the Ukrainians are clearly aiming to repeat the exact same move the Russians did here in the northern parts of the city. The objective of the Ukrainians here is to push through from the eastern residential area and the rear of the apartment complex areas to outflank the apartment complex buildings and encircle the Russian forces within it to then reach the highway area and cut off the connection from across the Usk River to the western parts of the city. The Ukrainians here are getting closer and closer to the encirclement of the Russian forces, the complete encirclement of them. However, they have yet to properly secure any of the well-defensible areas within the city. What this means is that if the Russians counterattack, well, the Ukrainians do not have any stable positions within the city, whether it is from the northern flank or from across the river. However, what we also see is the fact that the Russians still hold their main defensive positions, which means if they are encircled, the Ukrainians cut off the highway to the east and hold their positions to the north, well, then the Russians can still resupply with the drones. But again, as mentioned previously, if the Russians are busy resupplying their forces with drones, well, it limits their strike capabilities with drones, because those drones are busy resupplying instead of striking the Ukrainian forces. Therefore, having the supply line open is the optimal solution for the Russians. What I'm just saying is that there is a nuance, and that is that the battle is not yet decided for either side. Both sides can come out on top at this point. We'll have to see how the situation develops on both banks of the Usk River line and how much force there is behind these initial advances by the Ukrainians and the Russians here in this section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.